Bienvenue au séminaire en informatique cognitive. Chris ELIASMITH est directeur du Centre de neurosciences théoriques à l'Université de Waterloo. Il est co-inventeur du Neural Engineering Framework. Chris, is there a French equivalent, or is that what it goes by?
I haven't heard the French equivalent, but you could make one up, I imagine.
Well,
Framework.
cadre pour la génie neurale.
There you go.
L'environnement, logiciel, également une chose de génie neuronal, et l'architecture de pointeurs sémantiques SPA, tous dédiés à la compréhension du fonctionnement du cerveau. Son équipe a développé le Semantic Pointer Architecture Unified Network. Là, je fais pas la tentative de traduire ça, Nengo. Does that have an equivalent, Chris?
Nengo is just Nengo.
Okay, we'll stick with Nengo. Et de l'architecture de pointeurs SPA, tous dédiés à la compréhension du fonctionnement du cerveau. Son équipe a développé le Spaun, dont je vais parler aujourd'hui, qui est la simulation cérébrale fonctionnelle la plus réaliste jamais développée. You stick to that general statement, Chris, that it is still the most advanced framework.
Yeah, I'm happy to defend that.
Okay. Chris est l'auteur de How to Build a Brain, comment construire un cerveau, Oxford University Press, Press Université Oxford, et Neural Engineering, la génie neuronale, le MIT Press. Aujourd'hui, je vais parler de Spaun et ses systèmes généraux. Avec ça, I'm very happy to have you here, and I pass the micro to you, advising people that if they want to ask a question, they should put it in the chat, or yes, put it in the chat. I've been asked to intervene to say whether we should wait till question answer period for that question, or whether we should take it right away. Go ahead, Chris.
Great, thanks, Sion. Appreciate that introduction very much. And yeah, I'm happy to take clarification questions as I go through the presentation today.
Can you increase the volume?
Un instant, s'il y a question de volume. C'est pour ça que j'ai dit, est-ce que je peux... 1 second, please. What was it?
Sorry?
The sound is fine for the people far away, but...
You want me to try something else?
Yes.
Let me know if you'd like me to talk to.
Yeah, just 1 second. We're going to switch a few settings and see if it will change. It's the problem is coordinating the distance with the local. That's always a challenge.
Don't have any other.
Can you hear us now, Chris?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, count to 10 and I'll ask them if they can understand.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
5.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the interruption. It's all yours.
Okay, great. So yes, again, thanks. Happy to be here. Appreciate the introduction, and I am happy to take questions of a clarification nature as I'm going through the talk. I noticed that basically this group seems interested in cognitive models, and a lot of the talks that you've had to this point sort of focus on cognitive models. And in my lab, we do a lot of cognitive modeling, but we also do a lot of neural modeling. And the thing that I kind of like to push cognitive modelers about is trying to make their models more neurally realistic. So I'm not going to focus on a lot of the detailed low-level neural stuff that we've done, but more on the high-level cognitive and how we believe it can be connected to some level of neural realism. And as Stephen mentioned in his introduction, one of the models that we've built that does this is called Spaun. So that came out in 2012. And subsequently, we've developed a Spaun 2.0, which came out a few years ago, and we're working on Spaun 3.0 at this point. And you can sort of think of the way that research goes on in my lab is that we look, or students pick kind of like a part of the brain that they're really interested in, and they develop a good understanding of it, and they extend work that's happened on that one part. And then every once in a while, we try to put all those parts together, or all the techniques that have been developed together. So I'm going to be talking about this one that was kind of the last iteration, Spaun 2.0. And, you know, in general, one of the things that's helpful to keep in mind is the context of these kinds of large models. So one of the things that we like to push is this, as I mentioned, kind of integration of low-level neural details with cognitive science and cognitive perspectives on how brains function, or animals function, humans function. And of course, we think the way to do this is with computational theories. And, you know, there's been a lot of large-scale brain modeling where you really focus on the low-level neural details. So I'm thinking of things like the Human Brain Project. And there have been sort of very large versions of those, but they tend to not be especially functional. So they don't really do stuff in the way that we know cognitive systems do. They don't control arms, or, you know, process visual data, or make decisions, or on and on, right? And this is kind of the point of brains, I would argue, is to be a controller for the body. And so we think that it's kind of missing a big part of the story. So we like to do something different that we call biological cognition, where we want to take those biological details seriously, but we want to connect them directly to what the system is able to accomplish from a cognitive or behavioral perspective. We believe that as you increase the complexity of your model, you should be getting an increase in the complexity of the function of the model as well. So again, this is, you know, expressing a concern essentially about some very large scale models which have tons and tons of complexity in them, but they don't really do much in the sense of functionality. And so it's not clear what that complexity is really doing for you in an attempt to explain where behavior comes from, or how biology relates to behavior. So, you know, the kinds of techniques that we use here in the model that I'll be talking about, we use much of this more detailed stuff as well, which I'm happy to talk about. But in the context of trying to build really big models, which is what we're doing with something like Spaun, we have to sort of simplify our individual neurons, because our computers can only kind of run so many, or they only have so much compute resources, or so many compute resources available. And so we tend to use what we call leaky, integrate, and fire neurons. So this is a very simple single neuron model with a single equation per cell.
Sorry, what does LEAF stand for?
Leaky, integrate, and fire.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so it's a particular simplification of a biological neuron, which only, you know, kind of boils everything down to essentially one equation. And that leaky integration is essentially what the voltage inside the soma of the cell is doing. And if it gets to a threshold, you emit a spike. And those spikes are sort of, you don't model the dynamics of the spike, you just kind of say a spike happened, and you assume that they all look pretty much the same, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other thing that we do is we have equations that describe synaptic interactions. Again, these are simplified equations from real synaptic interactions. And so they're basically current-driven synapse models that then feed into this leaky, integrate, and fire neuron that causes it to spike. We can have different kinds of neurotransmitters in those synapses. As I mentioned before, you know, we are making sure that all of the parts of the model map onto specific parts of the brain. We think that they perform the same functions as those parts of the brain. All the connections in the model are real connections in the brain, and so on and so forth. So we're really trying to, you know, be careful about our biological realism, but we also are constrained by how computationally complicated a model can be. So to introduce this particular model, so this is called Spaun 2.0. Spaun 1.0 is described in this book, How to Build a Brain, and we also published it in Science. But this new version is something that has come out in the years since, as I mentioned. The whole model is simulated in Nengo. You can download this model and run it on your computer if your computer is big enough. The new version of Spaun has about 6.3 million neurons. The previous version was about 2.5 million. The new version has about 20 billion connections. The previous version had about 7.5 billion. The new version does 12 tasks. The previous version did 8 tasks. As you'll sort of see, counting tasks is a little bit of a weird thing to do, maybe unsurprisingly, because one of the tasks is essentially instruction following. So you can kind of tell it different tasks to do on the fly. So we just count that all as one task. But in any case, the architecture between the two models is quite similar. And a lot of what we've done is make the parts that we already had there better. But we have introduced some additional abilities, as it were, as well. So to give a quick introduction to the kind of things that this model does, you can see it doing sort of basic perceptual tasks, like in this movie, where essentially what it's doing is it's seeing images on the screen, and it's telling you if two images are of the same category or not. So there you just saw two dogs, so it's like, yes, those are the same category. Previously, you saw a monkey and a dog, so it said wrote a 0, which means, oh, those are a different category. Now it's actually classifying digits and just writing out digits that it sees. So with digits, it can actually write its answer out for that class comparison thing. It's saying whether they're the same or different, because of course it's quite limited in the kinds of things that it sort of knows how to generate as output. So its output is generally just, it can write digits. It is, of course, doing that with a sort of modeled, again, simple biological arm, 3-joint arm, which has muscles. You can see the muscles in blue there. And the tension in the muscles is, shown by the changes in color. Of course, this model, as I've shown it here, is just like a brain staring at a screen. So it's, very constrained, again, in its sort of physical realization. But we can dive into the model and look at the specific activity that's going on in any part of the brain. So there we're looking at the activity that's going on in the primary visual cortex, or we can see what's going on in more frontal areas, which are responsible for things like working memory. So you can see that digits kind of show up in visual cortex and then get stored in the working memory. And then we can also see what's going on in motor cortex, where there's a representation of the sort of high-level pattern it wants to drive its arm through, and then that, of course, gets translated through other parts of the model into actual tensions on an arm to move the arm through the something that looks kind of like the pattern that I'd like to accomplish. So, the nice thing here is that we've got perception, we've got decision-making, we've got action. It's you can give exactly the same inputs and record the same outputs from an animal. So you don't have to do a lot of interpretation necessarily of the behavior that you're trying to elicit. And then you can look at pretty much every single detail that you'd ever want to from that particular brain model and compare it to what goes on in real brains. So that's a simple perceptual task. But we also have it doing more complicated tasks like the Raven's progressive matrices. So here what you're seeing in the bottom left, you're seeing kind of the standard matrix form. It's being shown on the screen, that same information in a sort of serial fashion. And what it's going to have to do is figure out what goes at the very end where the question mark is. So it's basically been shown this set of patterns, and now it writes out what it thinks would be the best way to solve that pattern, to complete that pattern. And for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a task which is used to measure general intelligence in a fluid way. So kind of, processing information on the fly. And Spaun can do, that's sort of one example of the kinds of patterns it can see. It does a very specific subset of the kinds of patterns that you'll see on the Raven progressive matrices. But yeah, it can do sort of arbitrary versions of those. So it's never seen this matrix before. It's kind of learning on or figuring out on the fly how to complete that pattern. You can give it patterns that it hasn't seen, and it will use that sort of same mechanism to try to figure out how to complete those patterns and so on. And when you sort of do that over that subset, it scores about as well as an average undergraduate. So there's lots of different tasks here. One important thing is that there's no changes to the model as it moves between different tasks. So it can do all these tasks, and basically you just tell it which task to do by showing it other things on the screen. So you say like A1, and then it's like, okay, I'm going to interpret the next data as doing task number 1, or A4, and now we'll do task number 4, and so on. So one of the reasons that's important is because, one thing about cognition and human behavior is that we're very adept at changing tasks. We don't have to, we're not trained to be hyper-specific at one task like Go or something that you typically see in deep neural networks. But instead, we're generalists, and we can actually, control the flow of information through ourselves in order to solve different tasks at different moments in time. And so that's another aspect of this model that we think sort of replicates something that goes on in the mammalian brain. And there are, particular components in the model that are responsible for that coordination of information flow across the system. Oh, whoops, I went the wrong way. Right, so the way that we've built this, so that kind of what I'm done here is basically just introduce the model at a very high level, shown you a couple of the things that it can do. Now I'm going to dive into the techniques that we use to build it very briefly, obviously, and then talk a little bit more about the structure inside that model of how it works in a simple memory task, and then show you the kind of things that Spaun 2.0 can do that the original Spaun model could not do. So the techniques that we use here, as Stephen mentioned, are the Semantic Pointer Architecture and the Neural Engineering Framework, or SPA and NEF. Those are, the NEF was sort of the first book, and the SPA is the second book, this How to Build a Brain. Inside that, we describe 4 elements that are sort of critical for building these kinds of models. One is semantics. So how do you encode information externally and generate internal representations which have essentially some kind of meaning about the relationships between those representations? Another is syntax. So how do you process syntactically structured information in a fully spiking neural network inside of a brain? How do you control the flow of information and the sort of generation of responses? So there's kind of a couple of different kinds of control that we're worrying about here. One is like action selection. So what is the next best thing to do? Figuring that out. And another is then realizing that action by allowing information to flow in a way that is going to successfully execute it. And then the last sort of area that we talk about is learning and memory. So so this is just accounting for things like, that are kind of critical to any sort of cognitive function. So being able to adapt yourself on the fly to changes in your input, and being able to build up things like, working memories, which are effective for solving tasks or even keeping track of where you are in a task. And I guess it's worth mentioning, oops, darn it. It's worth mentioning that all of these things are done in a fully spiking neuron model. So, everything that the model does, you can, I'm going to be talking about all these structures and representations and so on, but really ultimately this model is a whole bunch of neurons connected by a whole bunch of weights, and they're all spiking, and that's all there is to the model, right? Just kind of as you would see if you just took a brain and looked inside of it. It's a bunch of spiking neurons. All right. So that's the thing that we are referring to with biological cognition. To give a little bit more of an intuition about what the semantic pointer architecture is sort of doing, or what kind of representations it's dealing with, I want to introduce this notion of a semantic pointer. So the architecture itself, specifies a couple of different components that actually have certain functional capabilities, but they also all traffic in or, are built around this notion of a semantic pointer. And you can really think of I think semantic pointers are actually pretty intuitive. It's kind of just a way of talking about vector spaces, which is, how people often talk about neural networks. But, to be kind of specific in the way that I use this word is that it's really referring to state space representations that are implemented in spiking neurons. So, this kind of brings into it the biological aspect. On the right-hand side, I've got an example of a visual system where people will often think of the visual system in this way quite appropriately. So you've got some kind of raw input image at the bottom there. Then this is encoded into a bunch of neurons, spiking neurons in V1, and then that goes to V2, V4, IT, and so on. And as you go up, the tuning curves get more complicated. And interestingly, the number of neurons goes down, right? And so if you're taking information and you're decreasing the number of neurons that you're encoding that information into, as you go through the hierarchy, then really what you're doing is a kind of compression. And so that's the other critical thing about semantic pointers, is that they're compressed state space representations of information represented in spiking neurons. So this can be things like a visual system. So, the visual system has a kind of compression operator built into it, essentially one that it's learned based on the statistics of natural images. You can also have other kinds of compression operators for building things like spatial maps, doing motor control, or doing cognitive reasoning. And for that cognitive one, in the semantic pointer architecture, we use something called vector symbolic architectures. And so this is a general way of trying to embed symbolic structure into a vector space. And there are many different operators people propose for VSAs. And the one that we use is circular convolution, which was sort of the basis of a VSA proposed by Tony Plate that he called holographic reduced representations. And so that's just another compression operator, basically. And so we have different compression operators in the visual system than we do in the sort of cognitive part of the system, but they're all compression operators. And for that reason, they're all methods for generating semantic pointers. Now, the reason that you want to do that kind of compression is because it basically is efficient. So if I had to take, all the information in the image kind of raw encoded, then I'd be moving a lot of data around inside the system. Maybe a lot of the data we wouldn't really need to answer questions that might be answerable by much less information. And so the point of doing the compression is to improve that efficiency and also to allow us to answer sort of surface semantic types of questions without having to process all of the information in the original representation. That being said, we do think that you can kind of go back down, so if you think of that visual system, I'm going from a raw image up to some compressed representation at the top. I can then strip that off as being my representation of a cow, and I can put it in working memory, or I could look up other features I know about it. That same representation could also be generated by somebody saying the word cow, right? And then I can take that representation, put it at the top of the visual hierarchy, and run the visual hierarchy backwards, do a decompression, and look at some of that low-level perceptual information if I'm trying to answer a question like, I don't know, how many spots does it have, or what color is it, the kinds of things that you would encode in a visual representation. So the idea is that even though you're doing this compression, it is reversible. And this is very consistent with lots of data that we have from the sorts of representations you see at different levels in the visual hierarchy, motor hierarchy, and other places in the brain. So, these kinds of representations are very useful for building these kind of large-scale models where you need to communicate between a lot of different modes. They are good for encoding discrete information, as in the case of VSAs, or we've extended that recently to continuously structured information like maps and so on. And it's a very natural way of capturing the semantics of the input that you're compressing in this way. So the real reason that we call them semantic pointers is because the pointer is kind of like, it's a sort of compression, and it's this idea that I have a representation I can use to look up the full representation at some time in the future, just like you have pointers in computer science. But those pointers are semantic in the sense that they've been compressed from the data that they're representing. And so they have a relationship to that original data, which you can actually exploit in comparing them even when they're compressed, right? So I could compress one representation of a cow and another, and then I could compare those two representations in their compressed state and actually learn something about the relation between those two images. So that's the notion of a semantic pointer. It's the kind of representation that is used throughout Spaun. It's the way that all the different components communicate with one another. And in some ways, it's kind of like the glue that holds the semantic pointer architecture together. You can think of it as like a communication protocol.
What's the unsupervised part and supervised part on the right?
On the right?
Yes, on the top right, the unsupervised and supervised.
Oh, I see. Right. That's so that you can think of this as like when building these models, you can build up visual representations which are kind of unsupervised by just looking at the structure of all the kinds of images that you see, and that will give you the sorts of tuning curves that you tend to find. And then the supervised stuff would be what you could do at the very end, where you're trying to map some visual representation onto something like a specific category or a category name or something along those lines, right? Where you're kind of doing the alignment. That part is actually, you can ignore it, basically. So that does kind of reflect how we tend to build this the visual system in Spaun, but I'm not really wedded to that in any particular way. No one has ever asked that before. So yeah, it's interesting because I just stole that picture from a different paper. Right, so turning to the Spaun model itself, right? So, that SPA is kind of like a very high level way of thinking about neural representation and a neural representation that's general across all of the different parts of Spaun. If you look at the Spaun model itself, you can map all of the components, as I was saying, onto particular brain structures, and that's what this image here is, right? So you can see that, we've got V1, V2, V4 IT, just like those layers that we saw on the previous slide. So that's all visual system. We also have subcortical things, which are in that orange box. So things inside the orange there, and the thalamus, right? Those are actually subcortical, but hard to draw inside the brain. And then we have some frontal areas, some anterior temporal areas, some motor areas, parietal cortex for doing things like working memory. So, you've got these sort of boxes with labels of anatomical areas, and all the connections you can see in there are real connections that you observe in the brain. And some of them have like more levels of detail than others. So you can see inside that orange box, we've kind of labeled the different parts of the basal ganglia. So that's like very anatomically detailed compared to some of these other components. But, regardless, right, we have sort of tried to be careful about replicating structures that you actually observe in the brain. And if you've got this color coding on here, and the point of that is to help us not only take this anatomical perspective of the model, but also a functional one, where we can sort of reorganize the model in this way, where this is like a functional perspective. It's exactly the same model, right? It's just a different perspective. And, you can see you've got the red box on the left-hand side, and that's like our visual input. And that, of course, maps onto the anatomy. We've got this orange box at the bottom, which is our basal ganglia, and that's responsible for something like action selection. And so what you'll notice in this view of the model is that I've got words which are, this is the function that this part of the model is performing that maps anatomically as it's seen in the other side. And here we can see a little bit more about how information flows through the system. So basically you have the basal ganglia sitting there watching all of the representations that are flowing through other parts of the model, and then deciding based on what representations are where at any moment in time, how information should flow through the system. And so it has outputs which go to those boxes, which you can think of as kind of gates, which it can turn on and off, which will allow information to flow or not flow, depending on what it sees in the rest of cortex. So the model's sort of control structure is one that we think is in the actual brain, where you've got cortex, you've got a basal ganglia, you've also got thalamus, and you kind of go through this loop, cortex, basal ganglia, thalamus loop over and over and over again, constantly, where the basal ganglia is monitoring cortical state and then making action decisions. So doing like action selection based on cortical state to determine next desirable cortical states. And embedded in there, you see all these boxes, which are, oh, I see you can't see my mouse. Hopefully you can see my mouse now. You can see these different boxes, which are doing things like information encoding. This transform calculation is for computing that Raven's progressive matrices, like recognizing the relevant patterns. Reward evaluation is for tasks where it can actually learn on the fly. So it's getting reward and using that to update weights and so on. Then you've got this working memory here, which is another compression hierarchy, where it's basically taking a lot of information coming from many different systems and compressing it into working memory representations of various kinds. There are kind of different working memories, sort of all represented by that box. And then information kind of on the output side, where you've got sort of high level representations in this motor processing area. So this would be the, kind of things like the general shape of a 2. And then on the motor output side, taking that general shape and decompressing it to actual tensions in muscles and, moving the arm through the desired trajectory. So one of the things that we like about this is we think that this nicely couples complexity and function, right? Where it's a very complicated model. You have millions of neurons in it, billions of connections, but it's very functional. And you'll notice also that these boxes don't have the names of tasks in them, right? They have the names of component operations, which can be combined in many different ways to do many different tasks. And again, this is sort of capturing our intuition about how brains are likely structured to do all of the many things that they do. All right, so one question, of course, is, well, can you walk me through a specific example of how this thing would work? So that's what I want to do now, hopefully reasonably quickly. So hopefully not too quickly, but just to give you a sense of, okay, well, what's really happening inside this model as it's performing a simple memory task. So we're just going to show it a list of digits, and it has to repeat that list of digits back. So the first thing that happens is a digit shows up. That will then, and this is just a raw image, that will then get compressed into a lower dimensional representation. The action selection system is sitting there monitoring everything, and it sees this image appear in its visual system. It already knows that it's doing a working memory task because you kind of told it that already with other visual images. So then it decides to route that compressed representation to working memory, because it knows that it's trying to basically remember that information so it can repeat it back later. So that compressed representation goes into working memory. It gets put in there. Other images might show up, and it would kind of do that over and over again until it sees a question mark. And once it sees a question mark, it knows it has to answer. So it's going to then take the information that was in working memory and route it to the motor system. And so now it's sort of changing other gates there to take what was in working memory, go through the motor processing system to the motor output, where it's sending like this series of, it's basically translating the representation of a 2 into a series of dots in motor processing, and then sending that to motor output and decompressing that to, to that final pattern that you see, which is what it drew at the end. And there we go. Right. So then it draws, then it's moved its arm through this pattern of a 2. All right. So that's kind of like high level, what happens through that functional diagram. So looking a little bit more computationally, right? So that first level, we're going through compressing that number 2 into a visual semantic pointer, and we're just doing that through a spiking deep neural network. And you can think of that, you've got 784 dimensions in your input image, and you have 50 dimensions in your output. And so you've done this kind of 784 to 50 compression. We then actually often do something where we map it from this sort of compressed visual representation to a higher dimensional conceptual representation would be a useful way to think about it, where you're going from something non-sparse to sparse. And in that sparse domain, you can build up interesting structures, like more conceptual structure easily. And that's then using this compression operator, circular convolution, which I mentioned before, where basically it will take that semantic representation of a 2 and bind it with this P1, which is a vector that it's generating on the fly, which just means position 1, right? So it doesn't have anything in its memory, so it just started this task. So it's like, okay, the first thing is position 1, the second thing will be position 2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It can generate as many of those position vectors as it needs to, just as long as you keep throwing stuff at it, it will keep generating new position vectors, binding those position vectors to the object that was in that position, the concept representation, and then storing that in memory. And so, it could then see a 6, so then position 2 would be a 6, and on and on and on. And it can just do this for however long you keep showing it stuff. Eventually, you will maybe have a delay or do whatever you want to make it harder to do working memory, and then say, okay, now show me this, or you show the question mark. So now it starts saying, okay, well, whatever in memory, I'm going to be decompressing and spitting out stuff in the same order I saw it. And so you've got that memory representation, which has all of this stuff compressed into it, whatever it saw. And then you are basically asking the question, what's in position 1? And so that circle is the inverse convolution operator. And it's spitting out a representation, which is what it thinks was in position 1, which ideally is a 2, right, if it gets it right. It's then taking that conceptual representation of a 2 and mapping this from 512 dimensional space down to a dense 2-dimensional representation over time. And that's just a series of points in 2-dimensional space, right? And so this is called operational space in motor control, where it's just like how you want to move your arm through sort of egocentric external space. And then we do this decompression from 2 to 6 dimensions, where we're going from the 2-dimensional positions over time to 6-dimensional positions over time, because we have 6 muscles that we're trying to control. And so that kind of decompression happens through the motor system, and it draws out the resulting path that you saw in those videos. So this is kind of like a state space representation, where we're talking about all these vectors of different dimensionalities and different kind of operations that we want to perform. But of course, brains don't do that stuff, right? So they don't natively do circular convolution or deconvolution or even addition. And so the question is, well, how do you get, and some of these operators I've just left, I've just said compress or decompress. So how do you put all of that stuff into a spiking neural network? And that's where this neural engineering framework technique comes in. And again, I'm basically summarizing an entire book in one slide here, but the idea is to give you a quick sense of how that works. And you can think of it this way. So you have some state space representation. In this case, we can just pretend it's 1-dimensional, it's X. This is then being encoded into a bunch of neurons, and that encoding, you can think of these as like the tuning curves of the neuron, right? So we know that different neurons have different sensitivities to different points in space, like in stimulus space. And so we've just kind of randomly distributed these neurons around the stimulus space. And so when we drive this population of neurons with that X vector, and you can see it's going up and down between -1 and 1, you get all this different variety of activity in those neurons in the bottom. And so at the bottom, we've got two equations, one which is just saying, project this stimulus into this space using the EIs, those encoding vectors. And then the AI, that's the activity, which is generated based on the current coming from that projection, going through GI, which is a neural nonlinearity, which in Spaun's case is a leak integrate and fire neuron, right? So leak integrate and fire neuron takes a current and generates spikes. And you could, put other kinds of GIs in there if you've got bigger computers, but we're sticking with a simple one right now. So that's an encoding process where we took a state space and we encoded it into a bunch of spikes. We can then define a decoding process, and we can do this optimally. And this is what the NEF basically tells us how to do, is how to find these decoders D, where we are basically weighting all the neural activities and summing them all up and giving us an estimate of the original thing that we stuck in. And so this is a weird movie, because basically if I have to time showing you the decoder right in order for this to look the way it should, but basically the values on the output at X hat should be the same as the values in the input, right? And they would be if I timed my presentation to you correctly, but it's really hard to do. So, whatever's coming in X hat is an estimate of what was going in X, but it should be exactly the same. In the ideal case, the hat is reminding us, well, it's not exactly the same. It's the optimal decoder for whatever the mapping is on the encoding side. So this we think of as representation, right? Because basically those neurons are encoding the information that was in your original stimulus, and you can extract that information by doing this decode step. So this is how neurons, spiking neurons, can represent a stimulus space. And that space could be a vector of any kind. And so this is why we can talk in terms of vector spaces and state spaces. We can always embed them like this into neural activity. Now, we can do this again, right? So we can take another population of neurons, and we can take the decoded output from that population, put it into some more neurons, get different spikes, decode that. And again, if I had timed this right, then what's coming out on the right-hand side would be the same as what was going on in the incoming side. And the interesting thing here is that all these operations in the middle are linear, and that means that we can actually compress them into a weight matrix. So now what we've done is we basically said, okay, I've got an input state space, and then I'm taking that input space and moving it from one population of neurons to the other, and I can analytically compute the weights to do that, right? So that's great, because it now gives us this real clear mapping between a state space and a neural network. So this is now a network because we've connected up all the neurons in two different layers. This isn't interesting because we're just taking the same thing we put in and putting it on the output side. So the question is, how can we perform computations? Like I want to do circular convolution, and I want to do all these decompression operations, and a lot of these are nonlinear and weird. How do we do that? The answer comes down to this little decoder. So that linear decoder that I found, which was just replicating the input, we can actually find decoders which compute any function of the input X. And so that can be whatever nonlinear function we want, and we can estimate it the best we can using these linear decoders, and then we can stick those in the weight matrix. And now we have a weight matrix which is computing some function, like the square or the cube or the whatever yet you want to compute. So this technique is very good because it's extremely efficient to solve these optimization problems, unlike doing deep learning where you need tons and tons of data, et cetera, et cetera. And it lets us take hypotheses about functions that are computed in networks and embed that hypothesis into the neural network, into the spiking neural network. And then we can take all the spikes and compare them to real data. We can then build up complicated models like Spaun, where we've got different components, and then connect them together, and all again in the spiking domain with different kinds of connection weights, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a model that in the end looks just like a big spiking complicated neural network, but we have much more subtle control over what is being computed where in the network. That being said, big parts of Spaun are just deep neural networks, right? So we just took like a deep neural network. This technique I'm showing here, this NEF, provides us with methods for building spiking versions of non-spiking deep networks, which is quite nice, because then we can take those essentially and embed them inside a model and say, our compression operator just is this thing we learned from a bunch of data. But we also have this other ability to say, we want something that acts like a memory, or we want something that does X, Y, and Z, and build it directly. That's kind of, in some ways, the engineering part. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to do was basically show some of the improvements that Spaun 2.0 has over Spaun 2. Some of these are very simple, like the character recognition goes from 94% to 98%, where 98% is human level. So, it's as good at recognizing handwritten digits as people. Its handwriting, so its motor system is a lot better. So on the right-hand side there, the handwriting of the original Spaun is on the left and the handwriting of the new Spaun is on the right. And the new one is basically just smoother and cleaner and, more like handwriting. Absolutely everything is spiking. So there were some components in the motor system in the original Spaun model at the very end of it, basically, which weren't spiking. But now everything is. We have better matches to some of the serial recall data from human performance. So this is basically the working memory model is a little bit more accurate. Which is great. And we have more Raven's progressive matrices patterns than we had in the original model, et cetera. But sort of the biggest changes are things like, in the vision system, we basically now have this spiking neural network. This is the spiking deep network I was talking about, which can recognize thousands of categories of image, right? So it's just way better. Originally, it could only recognize 10 digits. Now it can recognize those and thousands of other categories. So the model is just much more sophisticated from a vision perspective. There's definitely tons of improvements that you can make to this. This is, I wouldn't say state of the art as far as building deep neural networks goes for vision recognition, but it's pretty good, right? And it's plenty more than what we had that we can do more interesting visual perceptual sort of reasoning with Spaun 2.0. In addition, the motor system is an adaptive motor system now, so it can actually learn on the fly. So what this is showing here is basically this arm has a hammer in it, which it doesn't know about, and it's learning over time how to handle the dynamics of this new tool that it's never used before. And so you can see it's basically learning with a couple of reaches how to reach to that little Santa Claus target that I'm moving around. And after just 3 reaches, it now can basically move to anywhere in state space accurately. Whereas at the beginning of the movie, which I can just sort of quickly show you again, at the beginning of the movie, it's not accurate, right? It's several inches away from where it's trying to get to. And you can see that this is actually all running on neuromorphic hardware. So you can see the spikes from that hardware on the left-hand side. And the little visualization on the top left is showing kind of how close it is to the target it's trying to get to. And so you can see, after a couple of movements, it's actually getting quite accurate. And then at the very end here, we're showing it basically after 30 minutes of training. So you moved all around the space for 30 minutes, and now it can basically move everywhere quite effectively. So this is something that was not in the original model. So this is basically additional learning that's included into the Spaun model. Oh, whoops, I'm going the wrong way again. Right. And so one example of what this can do, this is kind of replicating experiments that have been done with monkeys and humans, where you give them a joystick and tell them to kind of move to targets, but then you put very weird force fields onto their attempt to move to the target. So they try to move straight up, but you put this force field that makes them kind of go off all the time. If you leave them in that same force field, after a while, they can actually adapt to it and get back to very efficient, accurate movement. And we're sort of showing the same thing here on the left-hand side with Spaun doing that, where at the beginning, it's in this force field and it's very bad at writing these digits out. But by the end, it's back to what its original handwriting looked like, essentially. And you can see that it even learned, like it makes one recall error at the second last one, but it actually writes that like its standard handwriting. So you can think of that as kind of zero-shot learning, where it's learned how to write these other digits, but what it's really learning is the force field that you've put it into. So now any digit it tries to write in that force field, it can write accurately. So this kind of adaptive controller is something that's new. If you don't have adaptation, obviously it doesn't get any better. We've sort of coupled this with that classification task that I showed Spaun doing, where basically what this is showing is that it can do tasks while doing this motor learning at the same time. So there's no like interference between the learning and the ability to perform tasks. So basically at the top there, it's we told it to write a 7 if you see a police vehicle, and write a 3 if you see a hockey player, and write a, I forget, 9 if you see a whale or something like that. And so then we're going through and showing it, random images in those classes where it's writing out the relevant digits. And you can see it's getting better and better at writing those digits, but its performance on the classes is kind of the same throughout. There's no higher error rate. And then trials after the dotted line, we've switched the instructions that we gave it for what to do. So this is also showing a bit of the instruction following you can do. So then we've switched it to, write a 1 if you see an organ, write a 8 if you see a whale, and write a 2 if you see a military vehicle or something like that. And then you can see that the learning just keeps improving. There's no interference between what we're asking it to do and the learning set, et cetera. And then at the end, we're just asking it to do a completely different task. We're saying, okay, write these digits out. And of course, it can write those digits, even though this entire time it's in this weird motor force field. So yeah, so this is really just kind of trying to show very simple instruction following, but also that there's no interference between these tasks as you would expect. So then moving on to sort of one of the main new things that the Spaun 2.0 does, this is instruction following. So this is simple instruction following, where it's kind of like a sort of quick stimulus response task where you basically say, if you see a 1, write a 3, if you see a 2, write a 4, things like that. And so it does it and does it quickly. This instructed stimulus response task is where on every trial, you're changing that mapping, right? So the first trial, you're saying, if you see a 1, write an 8, if you see a 2, write a 1. And then on the second trial, you're saying, if you see a 1, write a 2, if you see a 2, write an 8. So you're constantly switching these tasks, like sort of what the mapping is between stimulus and response. And so the nice thing is that basically this model does a good job of replicating the human data, where what I'm showing here is the relationship between the human simple stimulus response task and Spaun's prediction of the reaction times. And then same thing for the instructed stimulus response, where they all go up. So it goes up for humans, it goes up for Spaun. And the nice thing here is we can actually see where that change comes from. And basically it's coming from the instruction processing, the basal ganglia part of the model, which is what you would expect. But the fact that we can do this analysis and actually pull out that particular component as being the relevant one is sort of unique to this kind of modeling, right? Everything else is the same through the model. So, there's some delay in parsing the instruction, there's some delay in writing out your answer. That all kind of stays the same. And really what's happening is you're just putting greater demand on this thing that's trying to figure out what the next action is. All right. And yeah, this last graph is just kind of summarizing what you can see. Right. So this brings me to the last thing I want to show, which I like to call sort of mental gymnastics. So this is where you're basically giving the model a bunch of instructions, and then it's kind of going through them and doing manipulations to representations that it has and tasks that it knows, and just kind of doing a bunch of stuff internally. And so the way I like to give this as an intuition for what's going on is to have you as the audience do a mental gymnastics type task. This is one that Spaun can't do, but I think it gets the point across. So just follow the instructions I'm going to give you. So imagine the capital letter V. Imagine the capital letter B, rotate the capital letter B 90 degrees to the left, counterclockwise, then put it on top of the V, and then erase the back of the B. What shape do you have after you've done those manipulations?
Heart.
A heart? Or any other, have other intuitions? So the other one you often hear is an ice cream cone, like a 2-scoop ice cream cone. So yeah. Right. So what did you do? Like I was just giving you words, giving you instructions. You have these internal mental representations. You're performing transformations of them, and then you can spit out an answer at the end. Right. And so for Spaun, we're doing something similar, where we can basically give it instructions where, if you see this number, do this, or we can say, if you see this number, do this task. So those X's and Y's can kind of be tasks. And then you can have multiple of those instructions in a row. So when we're running the model, we have to tell it to follow instructions. So that's what the letter M is for. So, follow the instructions that you've been given. If you show a P followed by an N, it's like do a particular subtask, right? So you don't need to do this if you only have a single instruction. But if you wanted to give somebody a bunch of instructions and say, do the second thing I told you, that's kind of what this PN is for. Or if you just want to go through those tasks in order, you can just show a V to say, go to the next subtask. So, start at the top and then go through each of the subsequent ones. And that's really typically what we do in these examples I'll show. So what kind of things can we do with this? So this is an example where we're doing a question answering task, and then we're basically switching questions without telling it any new data. So at the beginning, we're saying, oh, sorry, let me restart that because it wasn't running on my screen. Right, so at the beginning, we're saying, okay, do task 1. So, or instruction 1. And so we're then giving it a bunch of digits and we're saying what is in position 3. And so it writes out a 6. And now we're saying, okay, tell us what kind of thing, like, i.e. what position the 2 is at, right? So then it wrote a 1. And then we're saying what is in position 2, and it wrote a 7, right? So we only told it the original information once, and then we're asking a bunch of different questions. So we're kind of getting it to do different simple variations on, you know, manipulating its internal representation to extract different information at different moments. So that's a pretty simple example, you know, where we just have one sort of type of subtask. Here, we're doing something a little bit more complicated. So we're going to give it a remembered list. We're then going to tell it to increase the value of all the numbers in the list and then ask it, you know, about a digit in the resulting list. So this is kind of more like the case that we were doing, you know, I'm telling you about V's and B's and stuff, right? Right, so we start with a remembered list. So it's given 3 digits, 3, 2, 6. And we're saying, okay, add 3 to all of those things. And then it's internally changing its mental representation to have all of those have 3s. And then we're saying, oh, actually, then it's writing it out. It doesn't have to do this writing out part, but it is writing it out. And then we're saying, okay, now what is in position 2 in that list? And so it will tell us, right? So yeah, you know, for a human doing this, I would say, okay, here's 3 digits, add 3 to all of them. What's the middle value? And then last but not least, what we're going to do here is something kind of like the Ravens matrix, where we get it to find a pattern. We're then going to do question answering. Then we're going to apply the pattern it finds to the question list and so on. Anyways, it's another more complicated version of instruction following. So we're giving it some numbers and we're saying, you know, find the transformation pattern between these things. So a 1 goes to a 3, a 2 goes to a 4. So what was the pattern? And it knew that the pattern was 2. Then we gave it 3 digits and said, what's in position 2? And it says a 7. Then we're saying, okay, apply the pattern that we gave you to position 2. So in this case, apply means add. So it's writing out all those numbers added with 2 added to each of them. And then we're saying what is in position 2 in that original pattern, and it's writing out a 7. So anyway, so this is here. I'll play that one again so you can see what's going on. Or you can sort of follow it through one more time. Right, so we're saying find the pattern in these 2 input-output examples, well, in these 2 input examples. So a 1 is followed by a 3, a 2 is followed by 4, and so it says, oh, 2 is the difference between those, basically. And then we're doing a totally different instruction, which is just what is in position 2 of this list. Then we're saying add the thing that you found from the pattern to the list, right? So it's writing out 6, 9, and 4. And then we're saying, okay, now use that pattern that you found to tell us the position, or what is in that position of the pattern, which was position 2, in the list that you originally saw. And so it's like, okay, I found the pattern 2. I'm looking at position 2 in the original list, and so I'm writing out a 7. All right, so mental gymnastics, right? So this is, you know, and all of these are considered one task in a sense, but as you can see, like you can sort of think of these as different tasks, but regardless, right? I think the point here is that we, you know, have the ability inside a model like this to do what is fairly sophisticated, I would argue, instruction processing, sophisticated in some ways, but also using very simple representations compared to what of biological systems, of course. All right, so just to conclude, I wanted to kind of point out that, you know, Spaun is not the only model that we built using these kinds of methods. And lots of actually other labs have used these methods to build their own models of various kinds. Yeah, so here are some examples of models that we and others have built, mostly us. But you can see that, you know, it kind of spans a lot of the variety of cognitive functions that we think brains have. So things like long and short-term memory, doing hierarchical reinforcement learning, and back task, the intelligence tests. That's where it actually, in that paper, we do the full actual Ravens progressive matrices. So it does the whole thing instead of just this one subcomponent that Spaun does, and so on and so forth. So, you know, this story continues. As I mentioned, you know, we're in the process now of talking about what should be in Spaun 3.0 and integrating a bunch of our more recent work into that model. But, you know, the main point here, I think, is just to say that I think we need this combined functional biological approach where we map what we think brains are doing onto the computational substrate that they have to work with to really try to understand what is going on in biological cognition. and that we, are going to have to, basically trade off the complexity of our computers and our models with the scale that we're trying to work out and so on. I think there's still a very, very long way to go. Obviously, this Spaun model is still about 20 to 40,000 times smaller than the real brain by neuron count. So, it's tiny, right, compared to what brains are like, which again, is why it's missing a huge amount of functionality that the brain has. But nevertheless, I think this is the right combination of techniques and so on to try to, move ourselves in the direction of building bigger and bigger and more comprehensive and more sophisticated models. So I'm hoping that this kind of model is an example to others to say, yeah, this isn't is a reasonable set of, or at least a reasonable starting point for trying to take ideas about cognitive processing, biological processing, putting them together. And we even provide tools like Nengo, which let you do that for, whatever model you want to build, right? There's nothing in Nengo that forces you to use these techniques, although they are very easy to use inside Nengo because we have libraries for doing SPA. You can just drop a basal ganglia model into whatever model you want, because they're all kind of like pre-built components you can just put together if that's something of interest. Anyways, so ideally this helps others as well as us continue to go along this path. And then last but not least, here's some URLs for more information and acknowledgement of the people who are doing hard work now in the lab and have worked on the Spaun project in the past. And I will stop there. Okay,
thanks very much. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, there's going to be questions. Unfortunately, Professor Bukhadum, who does spike modeling here, had to leave because he didn't have time to stay till the end. So there may be discussion offline later. But
sure.
For the questions here, what I suggest is this. Can I ask those in the room, can't be seen among the distance. I can see the hands of people from a distance, but I can't see you. If you have questions to ask, could you do the opposite of what I asked? I asked before that you should sit in the back of the room so you don't get into the visual scene, but could you move over there if you want to ask a question? Okay, and then I'll recognize you. In the meanwhile, for the others, all you have to do is raise your hand using the raise hand bar. I will use the chairman's prerogative to ask a couple of questions first. One is about scaling and the other one is about semantics. You started your talk saying that you noticed that in this series of seminars, most of them were concerned with cognition and behavior rather than the neural function. I would say you're right. I mean, it's a certain proportion did work directly on neural function. But the question I want to ask, you have a very big number of neurons there and a lot of areas that you label and that do what they do. What I wanted to ask was, in suggesting, as you did, that cognitive modeling and behavioral modeling, basically performance modeling and performance capacity modeling, in suggesting that that should be more neural, could you tell us why? Because what you said was that, well, the next time Spaun, when it doubles its size, it'll be able to do double those things. But is that really true? What I saw over here was all POI capacities, including the psychometric ones. Is it going to be able to scale life-size capacities? And if it does, what is the contribution of the neural part? That's my first question.
Right. So I take it, so the reason I would argue that we want to understand how behavior maps onto the brain is because the brain is the way that we're going to be able to explain mechanistically where the behavior is coming from. And, when we want to perform any kind of intervention, then that's the way that we're going to be able to perform an intervention, right? It's going to be by manipulating the physical substrate that gives rise to behavior.
What do you mean intervention? You mean clinical intervention?
Any kind of intervention, yeah. So, giving it drugs, giving it, other behavioral input, other kinds of inputs into the system, and so on and so forth, right? All of these things are interventions, and they're all, impacting behavior via the brain. And so I would argue that, that's kind of the point of models and theories and so on, is to understand, better characterize that mechanism for generating what we find interesting, which is the behavior.
Is what we're doing now an intervention?
Yeah, in the very broad sense of just providing inputs into the system. Like if you're saying you're intervening with my brain in the sense that you're saying words to me, right? And that's making neurons in my brain fire and maybe making things wire differently than they would have if I didn't have that interaction. So yeah, by intervention, I basically mean any causal effect on behavior is going through the brain essentially, right? And so if we want to understand the details of that, we might not want to understand the details. There's clearly things we can do without knowing how the brain functions and still influence behavior, obviously, right? But I think that the more specificity we have in the mechanism, the more specificity we can have in the intervention, right? And the more clear we can be about why a particular intervention is having the effects it's having.
I think we agree on that. I think everybody will agree on the fact that the more you know about performance and what's underlying the performance, the better, the more questions you can answer. But I still haven't understood how the brain part, let's leave out, of course, for clinical purposes, for drugs, etc., it's obvious. But we're doing cognitive science here. And so the capacity, when I asked you whether what we're doing here is one of those interventions, we're using language in a way that's incomparably upper scale from what you do with these toy tasks, and even with Raven's matrices or etc. And the question is, how does the neural part, leaving aside clinical functions and drugs, etc., how does the neural part help us scale up in the cognitive capacities, which right now, as far as I can see, are just toy capacities?
So, I mean, there's a fairly long and varied history of people wanting to know how the brain gives rise to behavior, right? And for instance, in the case of Raven's progressive matrices, people don't want to just see how somebody performs on the Raven's matrix. They want to know why they perform that way, and they want to know if there are biological markers that can predict that performance, right? So that I don't take that to be in any way weird for a cognitive neuroscientist or cognitive person to be trying to answer such questions. So it comes down to a question of what sorts of why questions are you attempting to answer. And a lot of the why questions that are in cognitive neuroscience and cognitive science in general are why that particular behavior, why does the brain act in that way, or what is it about the brain, that mechanisms that result in that output? If I give different inputs, what brain mechanisms parse those? How does it impact those mechanisms to give me different outputs later on, right? Which is, kind of like trying to better understand why cognitive interventions, i.e. just even purely talking ones, have caused people to react or not react, or learn or not learn, or all the other kinds of things that we care about. So yeah, I don't think it is strange in any way to, as a cognitive scientist, to want to know what the mechanisms underlying cognition are. As for the toy aspect of it, absolutely, right? That's how I concluded my talk. It's like, this is 20,000 times smaller than a brain. What we're trying to do, of course, is get to some core element of something that's going on inside the brain that we believe can scale. And I will definitely argue vehemently that all the techniques, we have very carefully picked techniques that will scale, right? So we have taken these semantic pointer representations of language and built human scale conceptual systems, simpler than human conceptual systems, but human scale, right? So they have hundreds of thousands of concepts with relations between all the concepts inside of them. And this is work that we've published in the past. So we know that those representations can scale to the sorts of representational complexity that humans can, while still being implementable in the brain, right? And I think that is something that a lot of other proposals for how concepts are represented and structures represented in the brain, they don't do that. And I talk about that in the later chapters of the book, that we've been careful to make sure that all this neural stuff, although we're doing it in a really small way, we've got little bits and pieces where we scaled it, right? We scaled it, and we can argue that, yeah, we need a lot bigger computers, we need to do a lot more work, et cetera, but the potential for scaling definitely is there.
There's more to be said, but I don't want to overuse the chairman's prerogative. Others. I will retake the chairman's prerogative if nobody asks any questions.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Mario.
Yes, I noticed, thank you for the presentation, excellent, excellent stuff. I noticed that you emphasized on spike coding and that everything is based on spiking. So there is no rate coding in this architecture, only spiking. And are you with spiking or rating rate coding doctrine of the brain?
So yeah, actually in the original neural engineering framework book, we do address this issue a little bit. And what we argue is that the techniques we apply move smoothly between spike coding and rate coding, which I think is appropriate because depending what part of the brain you're looking at, some things look more like spike coding and some things look more like rate coding. In the Spaun model itself, we use only spikes, but you can use spikes and still be doing rate coding, right? So I think there are parts of the model where you'd probably say, oh, that's more like rate coding, like in our visual system, for instance. And then there are other parts which are much more like spike coding, very sensitive to spike timing, more like the basal ganglia processing that's going on. So I believe that the brain doesn't either do spike coding or rate coding. It does both, and it does different things in different parts of the brain. And even within one part of the brain, it will do something more like spike coding for one task and something more like rate coding for another task. But the techniques that we're using can move you smoothly between spike coding and rate coding, I believe, in a way that's analogous to how that is implemented in the brain.
Very nice, thank you.
Other questions? Otherwise, be warned, I have more. Well, nothing.
Actually, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I came late to the talk, so I may have missed something, but the one question I had, I think you had said your implementation was working quite well with very large number of visual categories now and had started out with a small number, now we're up to 1,000, but
yeah,
not nearly as perhaps large and as accurate as a standard DL implementation like VGG or something like that, or whatever the latest version of this of these things are. One of the problems with very large scale networks is interpretability. So obviously going and looking at hidden units, which there has been some heroic attempt. Chris Olah at Google Brain and some open AI people started a journal, and it basically failed because there was little interest in figuring out what hidden unit 52 and layer 5000 was actually doing. Right. But they did find out some interesting items. Now, in your implementation, is it easier for you to understand what exactly it's doing when it does a classification?
I mean, I think the short answer is no, right? Because essentially the thing that is doing the classification is going through a deep network. So our network's not as deep as the latest ones where they have like hundreds of layers. You know, we only have 4.
Well, so like thousands, tens of thousands of layers.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So we would like, we have compared, you know, like the tuning curves in our model to those particular areas of the brain. And there is another branch of deep learning neural network where people do that, where they basically build the model, compare the responses to tuning curves you see in the brain, and then also try to enforce some of the connectivity and biological property. And those are the kinds of models that we would prefer and probably put into Spaun if we were going to go and build out the visual system in more detail.
But how would that help in terms of interpretability? I mean, I suspect maybe, although obviously we don't know how the visual pathways in the brain actually do work, that it would be useful if you had more biological plausibility that you might get at a mechanistic level that would be relevant to neuroscientists in their work. And this creates a bridge. I get that. But it does seem like there's not a uniqueness here. That is, there's not an equivalence class of these approaches that are identical. You're going to end up with many different kinds of solutions. And one of them is the deep learning kind of solution, which of course people like Jeff Hinton roundly reject. And he just came out with a new method that he thinks is better. He tells me it works the same way, but it's the forward method, and it doesn't have any more interpretability, but it works almost as well as backpropagation. So there's some gold standard here that is kind of perverting the way in which we can get to, penetrability of what's happening, of these mechanisms. In other words, are you just kind of creating another surface layer on something that's already obscured by going after biological plausibility in this way? I mean, I feel the same way about what Jeff is doing, frankly.
Yeah, so restricting our conversation, there's a couple of things going on here, right? So restricting our conversation to just the visual system is part of the reason that you don't have better interpretability, right? If we look at Spaun as a whole, we've got way better interpretability than you do in a deep learning model, right? So nobody is trained backpropped through a model that can do stuff as complicated as Spaun, precisely because it's too hard, right? And we, in contrast, can actually go into a model and say, yeah, this is what's in memory right now, and this is what's being represented. We can answer all those questions that people want to answer for deep network models, but they can't. But in the visual system, because we've adopted a deep neural network, we don't have greater interpretability kind of in general, but the fact that we are using the brain as the comparator, right? We're not introducing more stuff or allowing it to do things outside of what brains could be doing. And so all of the neural experiments and stuff that people have done on brains in some ways go some way to letting us understand, this is V1, this is doing what V1 does. We can, because you have access to literally every neuron, you can completely map the manifold that exists in these networks and say, okay, that's the manifold that is in our brain model, and we think it's mapping onto the brain one-to-one, so that's the manifold in the brain, right? So you can try to get a bit farther, I would say, in understanding biological vision at least. But if your sort of classification of goodness is just how well can I solve this data set, then yeah, you're not getting any sort of farther in understanding why VGG works better than ResNet, works better than whatever. But that's also not the question we care about, because we're looking at this biological cognition side, right?
I understand, and I don't want to monopolize, Stephen, so just cut me off if I'm going on too long. But the problem, of course, with backpropping through different areas of the brain, of course, there's many different networks in the brain that we could imagine are being optimized in different ways, and we neuroimage them all the time, with fMRI. However, understanding the way that the recurrence and the actual network complexity is producing the kinds of real behavior or artifacts or whatever it is we're seeing in behavior, we're nowhere near that. And so I worry about a model, obviously all of the connectionist stuff from the 80s are caricatures, they're cartoon models. Yours is a better cartoon model, but I still feel it's a cartoon model in a way that may be misleading.
No, okay, so now we're talking about the whole model, right? And this is where I will disagree with you.
I am.
Yeah, so at the level of the whole model, right, we have, explicit functional hypotheses. Like we write down a differential equation that says, this is how states evolve over time in our working memory. And then we implement that in spiking neurons, and then we can compare it to neural data, and we can see what behaviors it performs.
Well,
so now we know.
How many regions of the brain are you targeting for working memory? I mean, if you're looking at, say, a network model at the course level, you might target 5 to 10 to 20 different areas.
Yeah, so we have about 7, I think, in our model. So what, some of the working memory is keeping track of what the task is. Some of the memories are keeping track of, information that's coming right from the decoder. Other stuff is keeping track of things that happened in the past, et cetera, et cetera. So there are different working memories. But all I'm doing, what I'm trying to do is explain how this is not deep learning, right? So we're not taking a big black box, specifying the output and the input, and backpropping through the whole thing. That never showed up anywhere in my explanation of how we built a working memory system. And to me, this is why you have better explainability. And people have often pointed to this neural engineering framework as providing you with explainability in a way that it's a white box method, basically. You know what's going on inside. So, our vision system is black box, but most of the rest of the other systems are not.
Well, I could go on. I'm truly enjoying talking to you, and I think this is a wonderful kind of framework to build on. I think there's others. I think Randy McIntosh, although it's not as computational, he's built a virtual brain, and there's other people in this. but we're not really at the point where we can compare these things. I do believe there's still an equivalence class issue here about the fact that, look, classical conditioning we know was invented thousands of times, and in some mollusks and rats and so on, there's different versions of it. But associative learning at a functional level is clearly very important, and it just got reinvented at a mechanical level, at the neural level, different ways. So the structure of that neural tissue or the neural piece parts not going to be predictable very well from a behavioral level. It's impossible.
Well, I mean, yeah, we're just restricting ourselves to mammalian brains. So, and we're not trying to go from behavior to.
Well, I think that makes it worse, but yeah.
Well, I mean, it makes it better because we don't have to worry about mollusks. Right?
Well, you don't have to worry about classical conditioning because, I mean, if you're looking at counting or arithmetic, yes, I grant you humans.
No,
like
but
to do
yeah,
more
even
than
looking at
that.
low-level stuff, it's helpful because we have all kinds of rodent and mouse data. But the other thing I want to point out is we're not going from behavior to neurons. We're going from neurons and behavior to a combined model, right? So we have constraints both from the bottom up and the top down. And I think that's part of the reason that we have some hope of success, right?
I have a question, please.
Possibly.
Go ahead, Mario.
Yes, can we go back to the slide where there is the coder and decoder? I have a question about it.
Yeah, sure. There we go.
Yes, exactly here. Here you said that X, the numbers gonna be equal, but when you had the X with the hat on it, shouldn't be like a category, because similar X coming, similar input, similar stimulus should give like an approximation or like a category of it. So how do you deal with the decoding later on? For example, here, the X hat, you said it should be equal to the incoming X.
That's
but
right.
Similar X should give one X hat. So because
no, that's only you're assuming a function. I'm not assuming a function to start, right? So here I'm just talking about representation, which means I want to show that the information in the original signal is encoded in my spikes. So if I wanted to do classification, right, then I'm putting some nonlinear function on top of my stimulus representation, and then I would want, then I'd want it to be, classifying things and putting it into particular categories. But the very, very beginning here, all I'm doing is encoding a signal and then decoding that exact same signal. So I'm really just
it is one-to-one relation.
Yeah,
here,
I'm computing the identity function to start.
Okay, and I have other question about the slide before it, maybe, where you have the whole model and you have the squares with the dots and or lines, like you have rectangles with lines around them or dotted lines. So what's the difference? The slide before it, maybe, or?
Oh, like the anatomy slide?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, the dotted lines was indicating it's subcortical.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yes, and finally, when I asked about the unsupervised and supervised, so I was wondering if you apply unsupervised learning, like to organize the input or to do stuff like that, if it is related to this, or not necessarily. Like, do you think we should do unsupervised learning before supervised learning? Like, it helps in a way. Or sometimes.
Yeah, so all I want to do, so I have an opinion, but I just want to say that this is kind of independent of all the stuff I talked about. All right, so
yeah, no problem.
Because in some ways, you can think of what we're doing here as introducing a different way of doing supervised learning. And the reason it's supervised is because, as I said, you have a hypothesis about your dynamical system, and then you embed that, right? So you could think of that as supervised because you're kind of saying, they want to do this. So I do think that unsupervised learning can be helpful. And we do have ways of doing unsupervised learning as well that I haven't talked about. But again, I think it's a little bit sort of beside the point here. But I definitely believe that the brain, uses unsupervised learning all the time in order to try to figure out the statistics of the stimulus space to make it easier for it to compute functions down the road, right?
Okay.
So yeah, when we build, we build a lot of deep learning models as well. And when we build those, we use unsupervised learning all the time. And the more the more we can figure out ways of doing unsupervised learning, the better, right? Frankly, for the models. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Very good. And finally, if I may ask, like one idea I like, what is important here, I notice it is the assignment of the tasks between the different regions of the model. This is, I find it very, very important. And another point I want to ask you about, it is about when you mentioned about decision making, where, because there is a competition affordance hypothesis of CISC, which says like the brain may lay out all the options in front of it and then chooses which option is the best. But, or we have, or we always have all the options, and depending on the input, we directly make the association to the best option. So in your model, what is going on? Like you always have different options, different possibilities, different decisions, and like how you pick up the best decision.
Yeah, so that is actually, so I'll go back to the answer I gave you about the dotted line seems to be wrong. So it's not the case that these are all subcortical. So I honestly don't remember. I thought that's what it was. But in any case,
it's okay. It's okay. I analyze it like maybe some processing will go on because the reward, it was.
I think
I noticed the ones that has processing, maybe they are dotted. I don't know.
No, yeah, no, I think it's just a way of, like in other parts of the paper, to refer back so we didn't confuse people. So you can see like the dotted line on the AIT there in the functional diagram is picking out a different function. So it was just like when mapping to there, here we wanted to be able to have red to say it's still visual processing and it's kind of in the visual hierarchy, but it's a different function that we're mapping onto it compared to the rest.
Okay, okay. Anyway. I can check the paper. Yeah, no problem. Yeah. But yeah, nice. Thank you.
Yeah, so the your question about making these decisions about picking the best action. So this is essentially what the basal ganglia is doing, right? So the basal ganglia is always seeing a bunch of different cortical states across all the areas. And the way the basal ganglia is set up is it's essentially generating a value for each of those states, and then picking the highest value. And then based on the highest value that it picked, it's, you know, routing information in an appropriate way. And so we constantly have this action selection going on all the time, just like through the entire model, as people sort of think the basal ganglia does in the brain, right?
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay, we still have a few more moments. It's still open to the rest of you. I won't jump in except to fill the remaining moments if no one else wants to ask. And one thing that I was going to mention, besides going back to the original point that I made, is why do you call the pointers that do the compression semantic?
Because they capture conceptual relations between objects or between representations.
I don't, whose concepts? I mean, the device that implements Spaun is doing whatever it's doing. Okay, we have concepts. The device is
so the representations are, so, you know, the way we typically think of semantics is things like, you know, the number 2 comes after the number 1, the number 3 comes after the number 2. That's like a very simple arithmetic semantics, right?
Yes, ours.
Okay, so that's, those kinds of relationships are captured by the things I'm calling semantic or concept pointers inside the model. So, you know, the model is knows 2 comes after 1, 3 comes before 2, et cetera, can count. So that kind of semantics is represented by these structured semantic pointer representations. And that's why I call it semantic.
Okay, we have another question. Pierre, go ahead. Could you show your face?
Yes, I will try. First, as a retired engineer, I can only be extremely impressed with the machine that you've created there. Now, to say that this machine is a brain, there is a stretch in there.
I didn't say it was a brain.
Sorry?
I didn't say it was a brain. It's
well,
a brain model. It's a brain model. Yeah.
Your book is entitled How to Build the Brain.
Yeah, how to build a brain model.
No, the book is not how to build the brain.
I mean, you know, it would be the
Okay,
brain
I
for
know.
it would be the brain for a robot body if we stuck it inside that body, right?
Okay, it's a brain. It's a brain model, and in there, like with the slide that you show right now on the screen, the part there about action selection is really a program to tell that machine how to do what you want it to do. It is fully programmed to do these things. So it recognizes, you put some symbols in front of the visual input, and you have, and you build the action selection such that it does with this symbol, it handles the symbols the way you interpret it. So what the machine, instead of semantic pointers, what you really have is symbol pointers, and the action selection knows from that symbol exactly what it has to do to perform the action that you want the machine to perform. So,
I would argue it's not a symbol. So like and this is something we can go into in all kinds of gory detail. So, but I will say that like your basic characterization of the functioning is correct, right? That, you know, there are representations and the action selection system sees those representations and knows based on it what it should or shouldn't do. I will say that it can learn those too, right? So for some of them, we've told it what to do, and for other ones, it learns what to do. The reason I wouldn't call these symbols is because, you know, symbols don't have any internal structure. And I think, you know, the semantics of symbols is essentially external to them, whereas these are high dimensional vectors, which have sort of measurable continuous relations between them. And so that's why I would argue that they're, you know, semantic in the way that we want to have our semantics be something that is continuous, as we typically do.
okay, but somewhere there is a lot more semantic behind the question mark than behind any other symbol that is going through any of your commands. Isn't it?
I don't think there's more semantics there. I just think that, you know, the system has particular actions associated with that it doesn't have. I mean, well, it's not really true. Like it's doing things to every representation that's coming in. It's just that we see bigger state transitions, I guess, intuitively, as you would for a human, right? I don't think there's anything different about that than if I told a human, you know, I'm going to show you some digits, and when I show you a question mark, give me your answer. And so now I just made that question mark important for the execution of the task, right? And so you will have the same kind of big straight transitions after you see that more than the other ones.
Yes, go on, Pierre.
No, it's okay, Mario. You can take over.
Because there are only 2 minutes maybe left. I have an important question. When connecting all these modules and this huge number of neurons, did you notice any emergence of very high nonlinear dynamics, like chaotic dynamics? And
yeah,
if
totally.
yes, what is your interpretation of that?
Yeah, actually, one of the things that we did, because a reviewer asked us to do it after we submitted it, was to look at the statistics of the activity of the neurons in these various populations. And what we found is that you have the same interspike intervals that you tend to find in those parts of the brain. So that was cool, because we definitely did not build that in. And this is a statistical measure of neural activity, right? So what I think is going on, for good reason, I've done other stuff on chaos. Like you can implement chaotic dynamical systems using these methods very easily. And I basically think we built a chaotic dynamical system, almost for sure. What you're seeing is a perfectly deterministic system. We don't inject noise anywhere. But you know, the way that you measure the system for trying to give these statistical metrics is you're treating the chaotic dynamics as a statistical measure. And when you do that, you seem to get similar numbers to what you see in the brain. And so I think we're probably doing the same thing with the brain, right? Where it's a very big, complicated, chaotic, nonlinear dynamical system. Yeah, we often mistake things like Poisson neural activity. It's just like we don't know enough about where the neural activity is coming from to be able to predict all the spikes. In the case of Spaun, we could.
Nice.
Yeah, I think that's how you interpret it.
Very interesting, exciting.
Okay, thanks. Steve, And then
it's really sort of a passing shot here. So if we wanted a large, uninterpretable, massive neurons with connections that behaves in interesting human-like ways, don't the large transformers, the GPTs, as they're so called, sort of solve this problem for you? In other words,
that's not a problem, and I would.
But it does show behavior that is so convincing. We have large corporations trying to put billions of dollars into these things.
Yeah, behavior is impressive
because they talk like humans, and they have a lot of biological plausibility in the sense
they don't.
that, well, we
definitely don't have biological plausibility. You can't defend that.
With you, but he isn't here. But it does in the sense of in the 80s from the very early neural network models.
That's not the sense I'm talking about though here, right? Like that's totally different.
I agree. I am a computational neuroscientist, so I don't disagree. I'm just saying that from the sort of first view of this, there seems to be some kind of connection between this large massive system you're making and these large massive systems that seem to perform in human-based ways, unless you're denying they're not human-like.
No, what I'm denying is that this is a big mass of randomly connected, trained by backprop neurons. Like that's just not.
They're not. Well, obviously they're not randomly connected. They wouldn't work if they were. That's not a.
But it's also not trained by backprop. It's not like we don't know what's going on throughout the model, which is the case with the language models.
Well, we don't know what's happening in chatbot or GPTs, really.
No, we don't, but we do know what's going on in here. That's what I'm saying. Like this.
Well, up to a point. Up to a point.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You start using deep learning in the middle of it. Yes.
Yeah. So to a much greater extent, like literally everything except for the visual system, which is why I kept trying to bracket it off when we were talking about that, is not a deep neural network. We have not trained it with backprop.
I understand.
Yeah, so I think that's a very different comparison, right? So at ChatGPT-3, everything is trained by backprop, and concerns about knowing how it works are well-founded, but that's what doesn't apply to this model, I would argue.
On the same hand, you agree it's producing this enormously.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's way bigger. I mean, they have bigger computers, and it's doing way more impressive stuff linguistically than what this model does. And I will also tell you that we are looking at ways of taking small versions of those things, putting them in here and making them better, because actually, like, they're not very, there's lots of problems with those large language models when it comes to actually.
That's where you were going, yes. If chatbots wouldn't jump inside of this somewhere. Interesting. Okay, well, thanks again. I really appreciated the talk from what I saw.
If I can take one more minute or one more question. You say that backprop is not the right mechanism, and it's not biological plausible.
That's not, yeah.
I agree 100% with this, and no problem. But you're talking about circular convolution. Is that biologically plausible mechanism?
So we have to be, I mean, the short answer is yes, but you have to be really careful about your use of this claim of biological plausibility, because I would not claim that our method for constructing this system is biologically plausible, right? So the critique of backprop as biologically plausible is that we don't find anywhere in the brain that seems to be doing something like backprop in order to learn weights. Other things are going on in the brain to learn the weights that the brain has. That doesn't mean that we can't use backprop to build brain models. That's perfectly fine. And the same with the neural engineering framework. It has an optimization method, which I don't think is in brains, right? But we can still use it to construct brains. Once we've constructed the system, then we can ask the question, okay, is the thing we built biologically plausible in the sense that, real nervous tissue could implement that? And in the case of circular convolution, I think the answer is yes. In the case of the network that you get out of backprop, it depends on the network, right? Depends on the network architecture, depends on the connectivity you've assumed. There's all kinds of things that can be the same or different from what brains might do. But for circular convolution, yeah, we can compute that in one layer. Like that's not a hard operator to compute, right?
So what you're saying is that circular convolution is biologically plausible at the behavioral level.
Well, at the neural level as well. So at the neural level, like I think, real brains can be computing circular convolution using spikes, for sure.
Do you think?
Okay.
Do you think Spaun, your model with the right infrastructure, will compete with the Blue Brain project and the Human Brain project? Does it have this potential?
So I think Spaun is better than those models because it's functional. We have built components in Spaun to the same level of biological detail, like using 15 to 20 equations per neuron. We built models that have components that are as complicated as the Blue Brain project, et cetera, and put it into Spaun, and then connected the low-level details to the cognitive stuff. So there's a paper in bioRxiv that does that. And we've done some other work recently that shows how to do that. So I would say it's better than the Blue Brain project because it has function and it answers all these, biological cognition questions that they don't even touch. And I think it's equivalently able to incorporate biological detail to the same level that they do.
Okay.
Exactly. Nice. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks to all of the questioners, and thank you especially to Chris. A very stimulating talk.